Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Very much appreciated, and it's an honor for me to, present some of the work that we did with you. So today I'm going to talk about some essentials for successful reading instruction. And I am at the University of California. I used to be at Florida, but I moved here about a year ago. So this work that I'm going to talk about is primarily based on our recent work on a report on early grade literacy acquisition. And so today I'm going to talk briefly present an overview of that and talk about some key areas to promote improved early grade literacy skills and associated effective instructional approaches. And we'll have some time for question and answer. So this report is called the Landscape Report on Early Grade Literacy Skills, and you can Google it. So this work was supported by the USAID through Global Reading Network, and I worked on this one with some of my colleagues, Helen, Stephanie, and Pooja. So we had two goals in this report. One was to review relevant research on early grade literacy acquisition and instruction, principally from developing country context. There have been quite a few studies and evidence from developed country context, but we wanted to gather information principally coming from developing countries. And the second important goal was identifying effective approaches to improve literacy skills. So we took this larger ecological view in our approach because ultimately what we care about is students' literacy acquisition. That's at the student level, right? But then the student is embedded in larger social context, including family and schools and communities, and even at the system level, such as teacher education policy and language policy. And those matter as well. So we took that approach, and the content of these different levels is included in the report. So let me briefly go over the content of each chapter of the report. So the first chapter, we introduce the report. Second chapter, we go over different key areas for promoting a successful literacy acquisition. And specifically, we talk about some cross-cutting factors. I'll go over that today. And in chapter 3, which is a little bit a long one because we go over each key area such as emerging literacy skills, oral language skills, reading fluency, reading comprehension, and writing. And in chapter 4, we talk about other key factors and actors, including multilingual teaching and in multilingual context, and teacher knowledge and education, and parental and community engagement. And in chapter 5, we talk about some things that are related to long-term aspects. And chapter 6 is closing. So today, given time constraints, I'm going to focus on key areas of instruction, chapter 2 and 3, kind of leaving out writing, again, due to time constraint. I'm going to focus on reading, and I'm going to touch upon the literacy acquisition in multilingual context. So the report went through, this series of process. First, because this is a review of all the relevant work, we did search for, project reports and papers and journal articles through various engines. We also interviewed thought leaders in the field. We then integrated all this information and wrote drafts and got some feedback from advisory board members, and the final report is available now. So when we conducted this work in each different key areas that we identified, such as reading fluency, for example, word reading and oral language comprehension, we identified the level of evidence in each key area, right? So for example, the levels of evidence, we classified them into 4 categories: strong, moderate, emerging, and limited. So strong level of evidence indicates that there is consistent, causal, and generalizable evidence in the recommended practice because of available good quality evidence, right? Moderate level of evidence indicates that there's evidence, but we cannot draw strong causal conclusions yet due to various reasons. Emerging level of evidence indicates that there's no clear evidence about causal effects. Finally, but we can make some recommendations, right, based on some evidence in other contexts, such as developed countries. And finally, limited indicates there's really a severe lack of evidentiary materials. So this is a very important piece. This is the key areas that we focused on. This is the theoretical framework and the framework that guided our work. So suppose that reading development is similar to building a house or a structure, right? So the ultimate goal is reading comprehension. So children being able to read written text and comprehend it successfully, right? But for that to happen, there are two critical necessary skills that have to support, right? So one is word reading. Children should be able to decode and read words. And then the other one is oral language comprehension at the discourse level, called a listening comprehension. So those two skills are necessary for reading comprehension, right? So if you look at the structure, if either one is missing, this structure does not hold. The same thing, right? The same analogy works for this theoretical framework, such that if the student is missing either one of them, word reading or listening comprehension, the student does not have successful reading comprehension. There's also something called reading fluency. We place it right here because it acts somewhat as a bridge connecting word reading and listening comprehension to reading comprehension. Then what does it take? Now the bottom part is the foundational skills necessary for word reading development and listening comprehension development, right? So to develop word reading, we need something called emergent literacy skills. And they include print awareness, orthographic symbol knowledge, phonological awareness, morphological awareness, and orthographic awareness. And we're going to go over that. And to develop so-called listening comprehension, we need various language and cognitive skills, including vocabulary, grammatical knowledge, inference, perspective taking and reasoning, and comprehension monitoring. And all these are built upon foundational cognitive skills or executive functions, such as working memory, inhibitory control, and attentional control. So, before we go over actually each of these areas, I want to talk a little bit about these cross-cutting factors that are important for reading instruction. So the first one is instructional aspect, right? So for instruction, of course, there should be curriculum, and curriculum should be developmentally appropriate. And in our review, we found some evidence that in some context, curriculum is too difficult for the student's level. Second piece is instructional routine, right? Which evidence has consistently suggested that the following instructional sequence works well. So we first review what has been previously presented, and then present a new target material. And this is followed by guided practice, right? So students have practice along with the teacher's help, and the teacher provides feedback and corrections to the student's performance on that. And then the child or student has opportunities for independent practice on the target skill. And of course, right, if you want to improve children's reading skills, there should be devoted instructional time to teach reading skills, right? And finally, in terms of instruction, one thing we highlight in this report is the importance of automaticity. So you could develop an accuracy in one skill, but you need to also develop automaticity, right? So for example, when teaching word reading, children may be able to read words accurately, but they need to go beyond that so that they can read words accurately, but also with speed. That's automaticity, right? And we'll touch upon that when we talk about reading fluency a little bit more. So the next common cross-cutting factor is assessment, right? So assessment has to be aligned with theoretical models and evidence. And we talked about this theoretical model or framework, guiding framework, right? So what we want to emphasize here is the importance of aligning theory and assessment and instruction, right? So this is theoretical framework that we had. That means that assessment should be aligned with this theoretical framework such that assessment should look at children's reading comprehension, reading fluency, word reading, and listening comprehension, and all the other pieces. And of course, instruction should target these key areas identified in the theoretical framework. And finally, of course, instruction should be aligned with assessment so that actually instruction should be informed by assessment, right? So you assess all these skills in children, and depending on the children's profile, whether they're strong in some skills and weak in others, then you would target instruction on those weak areas. Of course, for assessment, assessment has to meet the psychometric standards such as reliability and validity, and has to meet the needs of different context, because you cannot directly translate, say, assessment available in English to Spanish in different contexts. For example, you have to adapt it, right, reflecting language and local context, needs of local context. And in the past decade, many assessments have been developed to be used in different parts of the world, including EGRA, Early Grade Reading Assessment, and other assessments such as Literacy Boost and ACER. And successful use of assessment includes rigorous training of assessors in terms of how to administer assessments and how to interpret them. The next cross-cutting factor is instructional materials, right? Materials such as textbooks, decodable books, labeled books, and any books, for example, for leisure time reading are necessary, but of course they're not sufficient because they have to be used in the right way in terms of instruction. And these materials have to be age and culturally appropriate. In many contexts, these instructional materials are not in great need, but in the past decade, again, there have been several initiatives developing instructional materials that meet the local needs. Given that nowadays technology is very prominent in society, but also in the classroom, considering ICT, information and communication technology, is important, right? There has been also some preliminary positive effects of using technology to improve children's reading. But again, right, it's important to emphasize that technology choice should be driven by pedagogy, not the other way around. And technology, of course, should be targeted for the local needs, right? Because in some contexts, access to electricity is a challenge, as well as accessing internet, right? So that those have to be considered in choosing technology appropriate for different contexts. Again, whenever you introduce a technology, teachers have to be trained and supported. So final cross-cutting factor is ongoing support for teachers, right? So teachers are the agents of change, especially in providing instruction for reading development. But then teachers are embedded in larger contexts, such as schools and districts. And studies have shown that not only just teacher factor, but also how schools are run, including leadership, is important, has an added impact on children's reading development. And in the chapter 4 of the report, we spend some time on coaching and instruction leadership, but I will not be able to talk about that today. So now let's move on to the key areas of instruction. So this is again our framework, right, guiding framework in this report. In terms of level of evidence, we found strong level of evidence about how to provide successful instruction for word reading, but only emerging evidence for listening comprehension, moderate level of evidence for reading fluency, and emerging evidence for reading comprehension. And I'm going to go over each of them. starting with emergent literacy skills, right? So emergent literacy skills are the foundational skills necessary for developing word reading, right? So therefore, emergent literacy instruction would be during the very initial and beginning stage of reading development. Evidence again, and there's a strong level of evidence for this one. And here are recommendations based on our review of evidence. So the first one is teach emergent literacy skills explicitly and systematically, considering characteristics of language and writing systems. I'll go over this in a few minutes. Second recommendation is progress from targeting high-frequency single-syllable words to multi-syllabic longer words. And the third recommendation is teach word reading in conjunction with spelling. So some teachers in developing countries hold a view that reading should be taught before spelling because students might get confused or mix reading and spelling, but evidence consistently indicates that teaching word reading together with spelling actually promotes development of reading. So let me go over one different kind of component skills of emergent literacy skills. One is print awareness. Right? So print awareness refers to an understanding of conventions of print and the functions of print. The fact that print carries message and print is different from illustration, right? So for example, in this widely read book, the Brown Bear book, when children are shown this, the children should be able to tell the print is different from illustration. The print carries meaning, and this part, for example, I don't know if you can see in my cursor, is that this is the cover page, and therefore this is likely to be the title, and this is author, and also you read from left to right in English or Spanish and many other alphabetic writing systems. And to promote print awareness, something called print referencing has been shown to be effective, right? So to do that, you can do several different things. One is guiding student fingers as the teachers and students read text together. So as students and teachers read, ask or encourage students to move their own fingers as we read text, right? So this is the finger. You would ask children to move their finger, brown bear, brown bear. Or as the teacher read a text with a big book, for example, the teacher can point as she or he reads the text, right? Brown bear, what do you see? Like that. Or the teacher can verbally note that, right? This word is brown. The next word is bear. Right, the teacher can do that. So these are some of the ways of using print referencing to improve or promote print awareness. The next important emergent literacy skills is orthographic symbol knowledge. This is basically the knowledge of alphabet letter shapes, names, and sounds, right? So, and this is one of the most important predictor of word reading and spelling in languages that have an alphabetic writing system. So the reason is, for example, when you see this word in Spanish, gato, right? So you pronounce it as gato because letter G represents G sound, letter A represents A sound, letter T represents T sound, and letter A represents O sound, right? The same thing, right? Very similarly, in English, you read this word as cat because letters C represents K sound, the letter A represents A sound, letter T represents T sound, right? So in English and Spanish and Portuguese and many other languages that have alphabetic writing systems, right? By definition, alphabetic writing system means that letters of a word represent sounds. Therefore, it's critical that children know the letters and the associated sounds, right? And therefore, it's not surprising that letter sound knowledge or letter name knowledge is really the best predictor of word reading and spelling in these languages. So studies have shown that teaching names also help learning sounds because names provide clues to sounds, for example. in Spanish. Better name for this one is A, and that's exactly the same sound, right? A. This letter is a B, and it has the sound, B sound, included in the name itself. In English, B, right? The letter name is B, and it includes the sound, the B sound. And the next recommendation is spending additional time for letters that are visually complex or similar, right? So, for example, B and D are very similar. P and Q are similar because they're just reversal of each other, right? And therefore, many students do confuse them. And that means we need to, when you teach these letters, spend more time when teaching these letters compared to other letters that are more visually distinct from each other. Another one is called orthographic awareness. This refers to the knowledge of letter patterns, right? So what's important is clearly and explicitly laying out and teaching letter patterns. So let me give you an example. So in Spanish, CH digraph together represents ch sound, and double R represents the trilled R sound, right? Like as in battle, right? And HU combination represents the W sound, right? And children have to be explicitly taught these different patterns. And there are similar cases in English, right? So CK combination at the end of syllable in English it represents K sound, and this is not allowed at the beginning of syllable. And the vowel, consonant followed by letter E. In this case, the vowel sound is a long vowel, like as in cake. Instead of a sound, this makes an A sound because there's an E at the end of the word. Another important, very critical skill is phonological awareness. As you well know, phonological awareness refers to the ability to recognize and manipulate speech sounds. And there are different units, right? So there are larger units such as words and syllables. There are smaller units such as phonemes. And children's phonological awareness develops from larger units to smaller units, right? So gato is a word that has 2 syllables, and recognizing 2 syllables in this word, gato, is easier than recognizing and manipulating smaller units such as g and a and t and o. So you would assess the child's phonological awareness, and depending on the child's level, you would start with a larger unit such as syllable level, or you can teach us a small unit such as a phoneme level. Different tasks can be used to teach phonological awareness, but the different tasks have different demands. So oddity and matching tasks are easier than blending or segmenting tasks, which are then actually easier than deletion tasks. So let me give you an example. So in these 3 words, these are 3 words: sun, sock, and ball, right? So for oddity, it would be as follows. You would ask the child to say the following words, right? Sun, sock, and ball, and ask the child which word starts with a sound that's different. That would be ball because it starts with a B sound, whereas the other 2 starts with S sound. Matching is the opposite of oddity. So in this task, the child would ask to identify the words that start with the same sound, in which case sun and sock will be the answer. The blending is the task where the child is asked to blend sounds. So you present small units of sound and ask the child to come up with a word. So for example, s, put them together, it becomes sun, right? That's blending task. Segmenting is the opposite. You give a syllable, for example, you ask the child to segment it into smaller units. For example, the word sun can be segmented into s, right? So that's segmenting task. Deletion is one of the harder tasks. So an example of deletion would be, say the ball, say the word without B sound. Then what's left is all, right? So that's deletion task. That's harder. All right. So, studies also have shown that teaching phonological awareness together with letter name and sound instruction, that is much more effective in improving children's word reading and spelling skills. Finally, one of the final component of emerging literacy skills is morphological awareness. Right, so this refers to an understanding or an awareness of morphemes in words, right? So this means that students know what morphemes sound like in language and what morphemes look like in written language, right? Again, morphological awareness is important for word reading and spelling, particularly reading multisyllabic words. So here's an example of morphological awareness. So one is a word sort, sorting words for different patterns, right? So for example, you can ask children how plurals are spelled in different ways. So I'm going to give you an example of English words. So here are words: rocks, porches, boxes, bears, dogs, beaches, apples, trucks, bus. And you can actually classify these words into 3 ways, right? So a group of words that have has s at the end for plural, another group that has es at the end, and the other one is a word that does not actually have a plural. So for example, though these words have s at the end of the word, right? Another group of words has es at the end of the word for marking plural. And the next one is an odd one, bus. It has only a single morpheme. It doesn't have a plural marker here, right? So it doesn't actually, this is not used as a plural word, right? So it can be sorted into these 3 categories. Another activity for morphological awareness is called add-on. So in this activity, students are encouraged to connect blocks like this, to add blocks to corresponding morphemes together or to separate them. So in the following words, there are 2 morphemes, right? Jumped has jumped, past tense, right? Screamed has past tense again. That's another morpheme. Singing has a sing and ing, right? Also, redo has 2 morphemes, re and do. Active has 2, act, if. Activate has 3, act, if, 8, 3 morphemes, right? So when connecting blocks, you can say the word, and students' job is to connect the blocks. Jumped, for example, they would connect 2 blocks to represent jump and to. For activate, they would connect 3 blocks, right? Act, if, 8, right? Or you can ask them to separate to indicate each morpheme. So here's a summary of the emergent literacy skills, and here's general summary, and here are some things to consider for variation across languages and writing systems. So now let's move on to the other column, the other important skill to improve reading comprehension. So we just talked about, improving emergent literacy skills to improve word reading. Now, how about listening comprehension or language comprehension? To illustrate then what it takes to develop a listening comprehension, I'm going to tell you a short story. Okay. There was a man who had worked all his life and saved all the money. But he was a real miser when it came to his money. So before he died, he told his wife, listen, when I die, I want you to put all the money and put it in the casket so I can take it with me to afterlife. One day, he died. His wife was sitting next to her closest friend in a funeral ceremony. When the ceremony was over, before the casket was taken away, the wife put a shoebox in the casket. And the friend said, you didn't actually put all the money there, did you? And the wife said, I sure did. I gathered all the money and put it in the shoebox and wrote him a check. Right? So This is supposed to be a funny story, a joke. This is meant to be a joke, right? So let's think about what it takes to understand this simple story, short story, right? This is a listening comprehension, right? You heard the story, and your job is to understand that. So one of the things that you need to develop this listening comprehension is vocabulary, right? So when the beginning of the story, there were words such as save and miser. You need to understand what those mean, right? What does mean? You also need to have an understanding of what the collection of words or combinations of words means, right? That's syntactic knowledge or grammatical knowledge. You also need some memory capacity. So as you are listening to the story, you need to hold information, right? So the prepositions or ideas in this story, you heard a sentence and hold it in your memory and continue to update it, right, with the new sentence, information contained in the new sentence, right? You need to process both of them, hold it and process information at the same time. And that's working memory. And you also need to sustain your attention, right? As you're listening to this story, there might have been some distracting things, but you need to actually focus your attention to the story. That's attentional control, right? And that's not all. The reason why this story is supposed to be funny is because you'll know that the wife did not give the money away. But however, the story actually did not say that, did not state that. But you know it because you know for that to happen, right? For the dead person to take the money, the dead person, the husband, then should be able to cash the check. But of course, he's dead, and therefore he cannot cash the check, right? So for that, you need to actually link what you know about how checks work, and then link it to the story proposition here. That's inference, right? So inferring information that's not explicitly stated in the text itself, in the story itself. So you need to be able to make inference. But you also need something called a perspective taking, right? You need to be able to understand the storyteller's intention in telling the story, or the thoughts and emotions of the story characters, right? That's perspective taking, right? Also, you need something called the comprehension monitoring. You need to monitor whether you're understanding what you're hearing. If you don't actually follow what you're hearing, then you would ask a question to the storyteller, right? So, in summary, what this part shows is all the language and cognitive skills necessary to develop the so-called listening comprehension. So listening comprehension is not a simple skill. It's actually a very complex skill, drawing these higher order thinking skills such as inference, perspective taking, and comprehension monitoring, as well as vocabulary, grammatical knowledge, working memory, inhibitory control, and attention, right? So this is a listening comprehension is a complex skill. So, however, evidence from developing country is weak. There's an emerging level of evidence about how to promote oral language skills. Despite that limited evidence, we were able to gather some evidence available and also evidence from developed countries, and made some recommendations. One is increase oral language learning opportunities, right? Oral language, you learn oral language by being exposed to quality oral language, right? But you need to be first exposed. And one way to do that is using a strategy we call it E to the power 4, E4. That stands for expose, elicit, extend, and emotionally engage. Here is an example of how to do it. Say here's an exchange between a teacher and a student, right? So the teacher says, tell me about what you're making. A tree. You're making a tree with a trunk and leaves. Yes, I like my tree. I love it too. It's a great tree with strong trunk and vibrant leaves. So here what the teacher is doing in the first utterance, right? The teacher is eliciting interaction. So the student can be engaged in oral language interaction. In the second teacher's utterance, the teacher is extending the child's utterance, right? By going beyond the tree, the teacher says a tree with a trunk and leaves. By saying so, the child is exposed to the word trunk and leaves. And then last utterance, the teacher again extends and exposes, right? So by using strong trunk and vibrant leaves, so the child is exposed to the word strong and vibrant, right? The second recommendation is teaching oral language explicitly as an integral part of everyday literacy instruction, right? So this does not have to, so oral language instruction should not wait for should not wait until the child develops reading skills. It should start as soon as possible. So for example, when teaching vocabulary, effective instruction includes providing child-friendly definition. A lot of times dictionary-based definitions are actually very difficult for children, and provide multiple exposed to words by defining it, using it in a sentence, ask students to use it in a sentence, providing example sentences, and involve students in deep and active processing of the words by relating the word to other words, right, such as synonyms or antonyms. So let's think about an example of the book, right? Say you're reading the book, The Giving Tree to the child, and one of the words included in this book is gather. And you can provide a child-friendly definition such as gather means to bring together, right? So you can give an example sentence. You gather leaves, you gather fruits, you gather friends, right, to get together. Or you can also talk about other words to use instead of gather, such as collect. Also, depending on the context, you can use the word pick, right? Another strategy to improve oral language is utilizing book reading as an important source and using interactive book reading, right? So instead of just reading the text simply, you would actually engage children in doing book reading, right? So that means one example of an interactive book reading is dialogic reading. And according to this, you read the same book multiple times on different days of the week. So when you read each time, you would ask different types of questions, right? So the first reading of, say, The Giving Tree, you would ask more simple questions involving what, right? So what is that, right? Or what is he doing? What is happening here? In the subsequent readings, you would ask more challenging questions involving how and why. Why did he feel? How did he feel? And why did he feel that way? Right? And there more information is available in this website, for example, or if you Google dialogic reading. Another recommendation is asking cognitively challenging or demanding questions in order to promote higher order thinking skills. Recall that inferencing and comprehension monitoring or perspective taking are important, right, to developing listening comprehension. And to promote higher order thinking skills, you can ask again how and why questions, right? You can ask again why, for example, did the character here do that or certain action, right? Why did it do that? Or does the character's behavior make sense? That would promote, right, comprehension monitoring. And why and why not? Why does the behavior make sense or why it does not make sense, right? So here's a summary of recommendations for promoting oral language skills. So let's talk about then transition to reading fluency. Again, reading fluency is kind of positioned here because of its bridging role between word reading and reading comprehension, and partially actually bridging listening comprehension to reading comprehension. So reading comprehension refers to accurate and rapid reading of connected text with expression, and it's strongly related to reading comprehension. And as it shows here in this diagram, right, guiding framework, reading fluency development actually depends on word reading development and listening comprehension. So why should we care about reading fluency? Here's an illustration. I want you to take a few, actually maybe 30 seconds to read this one. And think about, so this text shows some unconventionally written words, right? As you read this text and think about what these unconventionally written words do to your comprehension. So I'll give you about a few seconds. So I hope that you had a chance to read a few sentences here. So this is to illustrate what it is like when you actually don't have reading fluency, right? So when you don't have reading, so these unconventional written words, right? You have to stop at these different points. So what happens when you actually don't have fluent reading and have to stop at these different points is that by the time you finish the sentence, you kind of forgot about what you read in terms of, comprehension, right? So it interferes. These pieces interferes with your comprehension, right? So when you don't have fluent reading, it interferes with your comprehension, right? So that's why developing reading fluency is important for reading comprehension. In terms of available evidence, there's a moderate level of evidence. And here are some recommendations. The first recommendation is build in instructional time and opportunities for text reading and employ repeated reading, right? Reading fluency, of course, involves reading connected text, and therefore you need to have devoted time for children to read connected text, right? And one way to actually improve reading fluency is repeated reading. And for repeated reading, it's helpful to have relatively short text because what you're asking the child is to read the same text several times with a time limit, and therefore a relatively short text will be helpful for that purpose. And in terms of text, instructional level or slightly challenging text is helpful rather than very easy text for the child. And we can employ echo reading, choral reading, or partner reading, or whisper reading for repeated reading. I'll go over this in a second. And children need to hear what fluent reading sounds like. So it's important for teachers to model fluent reading. So here's an example sequence of doing repeated reading and teacher modeling, right? So on Monday, teacher can model fluent reading the text. On Tuesday through Thursday, teachers can read, students are asked to read the same text again, but for different times limit, right? So if the child read, say the child took about 1 minute 30 seconds for a text on Tuesday, and the next reading the child is expected to complete reading of the same text in, say, 1 minute and 20 seconds or 1 minute, right? So the child is actually prompted to read faster and faster. And each day you could engage in different types of reading, right? Assisted choral reading, or echo reading, or partner reading, or whisper reading. All right, so reading comprehension is the ultimate goal. Again, all these things that we've been talking about is all in service of or developing reading comprehension, right? So, in terms of available evidence, there's only emerging level of evidence about how to promote reading comprehension. But by gathering information and evidence from different contexts, we were able to recommend some things. The first one is build solid foundations in word reading and listening comprehension. As we just discussed, right, word reading and listening comprehension are foundational for reading comprehension. Therefore, without them, there's no reading comprehension, right? So the students need to develop solid skills in these. And of course, developing reading comprehension requires devoted time and designated time for teaching reading comprehension. And directly teach reading comprehension strategies such as predicting, asking questions, summarizing, and visualization. And I'm going to go over a little bit of these strategies. One thing that I'm going to spend a little bit of time is inferencing. You recall that inferencing is important for listening comprehension as well, okay? But I'm going to talk about it here. So inferencing is using clues in the text, either oral text or written text, to discover what was not explicitly stated, right? So basically, the child's task is linking what the text says and what the child knows, that's background knowledge, linking them explicitly to make sense, to draw inference, right? So you can do it at different levels. So you can do it at a very simple level. For example, you can ask, you can present these words, or you can even just show the illustrations, right? Say you're bringing this swimming trunks, you're bringing a hat, you're bringing beach balls, sandals, you're bringing sunscreen. Where are you going? Right? If the students put together all this, this child would infer that you're going to the beach, probably, right? Also, you can ask the child, you have a backpack, pencil, stationery items, where are you going? Probably school. Also, you can show something like this, a little bit more involved, right? There's a picture of, there's an open window, looks like there's a wind blowing, and there's a cat with, who has just finished eating a fish, and there's a broken jar or a vase, right? So what do you think happened? The child should infer information from different pieces, right? And then kind of draw inference about what might have happened. You can also do something short, like verbally, right? So Anna collected shells. Then she went for a swim in a cool, salty water. Where's Anna? So you would gather that maybe she's at the beach. You can also do something more extended, something like this, right? Tell a short story and ask students questions that require inferences. So you could say something like, Jessie woke up early and ran down the stairs with a huge smile on her face. She had been waiting all night for Saturday to arrive. She ran into the kitchen. On the table was a large cake with a candle in it. Dante, Jessie's brother, walked in holding a large box wrapped in pretty paper and tied in a shiny purple bow. Jessie beamed and quickly tore off the paper to reveal a box with a beautiful doll on the side. She hugged and kissed her brother and ran to call her best friend. The day was starting off wonderfully. So you can ask questions like, what do you think Jessie was waiting for all night? Well, how do you think Jessie felt when she woke up? Or why do you think Jessie's brother gave her the gift? Right? So these are all the questions that require the child or student to infer information. Visualization is another strategy. So this is really making or constructing mental images or making pictures in your mind, like this, right? Sometimes we daydream, we think about things. That's exactly the thing that the child is asked to do, but based on the text they heard or they read. So if the child hears or reads this sentence, right? He saw a small boy leaning against the tree trunk. Then the child is expected to picture in his mind something like this. So finally, I want to talk about literacy instruction in multilingual context, because this is actually very prevalent in many parts of the world. In terms of evidence, there's some moderate level of evidence. And evidence indicates that children learning to read in a familiar language achieve higher scores, right? So because they comprehend the instructional content better, and whatever skills are acquired in the first language or familiar language transfers to the target language or second language. And there are different types of various transitional programs, language transitional programs, right? Adaptive bilingual program, subjective bilingual program, early exit or transition from L1 to L2. But there are questions remaining about their effectiveness of these different programs. So here are some recommendations. The first is, to the extent possible, ensure quality instruction in a language most familiar to the child. Sometimes that's not possible, right? But if that's the case, of course, they'll provide the best instruction that we just talked about in the language of instruction. Second recommendation is bridge into a second language literacy by building second language oral language proficiency. As we discussed, oral language is a very important foundation for literacy, right? So therefore, it's important for children to develop oral language proficiency in L2 or target language. And of course, it's important for teachers to develop their own language proficiency in the language of instruction or target language. And finally, it reflects contextual issue and local needs. So here's a kind of summary, and this is the kind of final slide. So we talked about this using this guiding framework, different areas of focus for instruction and assessment. And it is important to target explicitly provide and systematically provide instruction on all these areas, and the instruction has to be closely aligned with the theory and assessment. So that's what I have so far, what I have prepared for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Thank you, Professor Kim, for this really interesting, in-depth, and excellent presentation. At this moment, we open the floor for questions and comments. And while we wait for our participants to place those questions and comments on the chat, I would like to begin with this question that has been crossing my mind while you were presenting. So from your experience and also from the results of this research, I was wondering, what do you think is the role of the families, of the directors, of policymakers in making this skills of literacy and reading skills an important issue, you know, when talking about early childhood development?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we briefly go over the effect of the role of families and communities in Chapter 4, but evidence is still very kind of limited in developing country context. But it's clear theoretically and also evidence from developed country context that family context is so critical, especially for developing oral language skills, right? Because this is family or home is the first school or learning place for children, right? For oral language, right? Children learn language based on what they hear in the household and in the communities. So by the time when they come to school, they're bringing oral language skills based on their experiences in the homes and communities, right? So therefore, it's very important for families to engage in rich oral language interactions, as well as engage children in reading books, right? So initial kind of activities such as okay, this is what the book looks like. This is how you read the book. Actually, when you read the book, when we talked about print awareness, where if you go from there left to right, all those things can definitely get developed in homes and the communities. In terms of a policy, I don't think that we have sufficient evidence about policy. And of course, also policy also depends on different levels, right? There's different levels of, district level and then different state level and different levels. And, whatever policy there is, I would say promoting, so policies that really promote these skills, the areas that we just talked about, right? So oral language skills, right? So if there is, say, teacher education policy, right? Then they would consider what are some ways to promote teachers' understanding about what it takes to develop oral language, or teachers' understanding of providing very systematic instruction on comprehension, or, we didn't talk about writing, but writing or emerging literacy skills, right? Whatever promotes those will be critical. So I'm not sure if I answered your question sufficiently, but if you have further follow-up questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Professor Kim. You did, certainly. I have another question, and this has to do with the evidence that it's out there on gender differences. Are girls and boys, in their early ages learning to read in a different way, or they have different skills?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So, the evidence that we have reviewed in developing countries, the findings were mixed. In some contexts, there were gender differences. In other contexts, there were no visible, gender differences. So it was mixed. In the United States context, there's an biannual national assessment of children's reading skills. What we found over time is there was a gender difference, gender gap. So actually, typically, girls outperform boys in reading skills. But however, over time, that gender gap has actually been very much narrowed. At this point, there's not really much gender gap. And I think it's because, of course, it's completely my speculation. But, I think as long as you provide systematic and explicit instruction on those pieces that we just talked about, right, as areas, gender gap can be reduced. There's evidence from oral language research studies that typically, for various reasons, girls tend to have a little bit more advanced oral language, right? Again, that really depends on environmental factors, right? So if boys and girls are both embedded in very rich oral language, of course, they will both, right, improve and have a developed oral language, right? But there seems to be some difference in oral language, but, that's, again, from limited context, and we cannot generalize, again, to the different parts of the world.
Thank you, Professor Kim, for your answer. So while we wait for the participants to place questions or comments, I wanted to tell you that all the materials that were used in this presentation, that include the synopsis, this PowerPoint presentation, and also the recording of this webinar, will be available in our COTAB website in the link that you see on the screens. And you can also access the video recording on our YouTube channel, also on your screens. So I don't know if the participants have other questions, comments. I don't know, Professor Kim, if you would like to add something.
Actually, I just kind of remembered. So the question about gender, at least in the U.S. context, there's a gender difference in terms of the prevalence of dyslexia. So children who have great difficulty in learning to read, right? That's dyslexia, right? So there's disproportional representation. So boys, actually, greater number of boys have dyslexia than girls. And there has been debate in the field whether this is actually identification issue or referral issue, because boys typically tend to have a more behavioral challenges than girls, and therefore they tend to be referred more frequently. So there were some debate about that, but a recent large-scale studies here, at least in the U.S., have shown that actually, after accounting for those referral differences, there is actually gender difference, and more boys tend to have difficulties with dyslexia, reading difficulties, than girls.
Thank you, Professor Kim. So I see that we have reached the hour of our seminar, and I see that we don't have any questions or comments from our participants. Alison Adain, she just write down, I know that there is an issue when it comes to play and learning.
Yeah. Yes, that's a great question, and this is especially a very important question when it comes to early childhood and primary grade, right? So what's important is what's included in the play, right? So immersion literacy skills that I talked about and oral language skills that I talked about, they can be all embedded in play, right? You don't have to teach them in a drill manner, right? So of course, say you're teaching letters, right? Letter shapes and the sounds, or phonological awareness activities, or you're teaching vocabulary. You can teach them in a game-like manner, of course, right? So you don't have to use paper, pencil, drilling kids. Of course, that would completely disengage children, right? So it'll be critical, especially for young kids, to present these activities in a very engaging manner. I would call it like a play-like manner.
Thank you, Professor Kim. So I think with this last answer and with this last question, we close this seminar of today. We thank you once again for accepting the invitation, Professor Kim, and we thank you also participants for coming today. And for those that joined the presentation halfway, don't worry, we will have the recording available by the end of next week. Thank you so much, everybody. Okay, and I'll see you in the next month with another COTAG webinar.